Good morning. I'm Sonta Henderson. On behalf of Austin PBS and Leadership Austin, thank you for joining us for this ATX Together Engage series. Our topic today is one-on-one with Austin Mayor Kirk Watson. Mayor Watson is 6 months into his term and facing some big city challenges like policing, affordability, and housing. The goal of the Engage series is to bring the community together to learn the latest on community issues impacting the Austin region and to create spaces for productive and impactful civic discourse. Our topics today come from the community who have submitted questions ahead of time. Our live stream audience is welcome to participate by posting questions in the chat or via text. Now let's get started. Mayor Watson, we're glad to have you here. And one of the things we wanted to talk about with you is growth in Austin.
Sure.
Austin has seen constant growth over the past 20 years, and it was recently named the 10th largest city in the nation.
Right.
When you hear something like that, what do you think about the constant growth in Austin and being named the 10th largest city?
Well, one of the things I think about is it's a sign that a lot of the reasons we were all attracted here continues to be something special that attracts other people here. The growth is a sign of great success. And so there's a lot of things that are more successful or are helpful because of our growth. More access to various jobs is one good example of that. But that's also the source of a lot of our challenges. The good news is that many of our biggest challenges in Austin right now are a result of really big success. And there's some that aren't, but we get to address those from a platform of success. So, and then the final thing I'll say about it as we pay attention to this is, we're no longer becoming a big city. We are a big city. And so that requires us, I think, to need to look at how we go about governing ourselves, how we go about making decisions, what we're going to do in terms of planning for the future that are maybe more mature than we needed to do before because we don't have time to waste on some of these issues.
You mentioned that we're no longer a big city, so what is your approach to addressing some of these challenges, and what do you think the community can do to help?
Well, a couple of things. One is, as I just suggested in the end of that answer, we have to work with some sense of urgency. There are many things that we don't have the luxury, if that's the right word, of being inefficient in the way we approach it. We also have to be willing to experiment. There are times when we hear people say, well, we can't do it that way. We've never done it that way. Well, it's okay for us to experiment. Austin's a creative town, so it's okay for us to experiment on things. And then if they don't work exactly right, if they're not perfect, which they never are, you can work to change those to make them work better. And then the way the public, I think, needs to be involved is it needs to express its point of view. Now, Austin has never been lacking for people willing to express their point of view. But when you're a bigger city, we need to make sure that we're getting the opinion of a broad swath of Austin, and we're not allowing or just listening to a small group of people when we need to be addressing it like the big city we are.
You talk about experimenting, trying to see what works. Let's talk about traffic. What's the experiment, and what are we doing to try to ease congestion in the region?
Well, there's a lot of things that are going on in there, and that's been our perennial problem, right? When I was mayor the first time, from 1997 to 2001, people ask me a lot, what was the biggest difference? Well, we're talking about it. We were becoming a big city, and we're now a big city. And so we were seeing a lot of the issues then that we could foresee where they might be. But let's talk about transportation. Back then, we could see that we were going to have needs related to transportation. So some of the things we did was we made sure that SH 130 got built. We also had the first ever election for rail. Now, it didn't pass. It lost by less than 2,000 votes, and I sometimes sit and think, wow, what would this city be like had we started that back in 2000, and how much cheaper it would have been. So now you talk about transportation in 2023 and where we want to go. You see that we're doing some of the things that will, I think, be beneficial. We're doing things, we have about $20 billion maybe more like 20 to $25 billion of money that is set aside for transportation infrastructure projects. Things like Project Connect, our rail system that the voters have voted for. Things like improving Interstate 35. Things like the airport, and then others. So there's a lot of opportunity there, I think, to make a difference in our transportation, and that will also, I think, play out in how we employ people, how we create jobs for people to go to work. But again, it's a sense of urgency, and we have to move on those things.
Okay, great, Mayor Watson. Now, you mentioned being mayor first from 1997 to 2001, and then, as we all know, you served as
Slow learner. Yeah.
You served as state senator for 13 years. Now you're back in the mayor's office. Can you talk to us about what you've seen that has changed, what has stayed the same within the city, and even your leadership style? What are you doing different this time around?
Well, that's a great question. Because I did it so well the first time, I can't think of it yet. No, but let's start with that. I think one of the things is that with the years of experience, I think I probably come at it with a greater patience than I may have before. And I certainly come at it with, because this doesn't sound like what I'm going to get ready to say, but there's a humility to it that I'm not sure I had before. And that comes from making mistakes along the way. It comes from hearing from people that didn't like the way you went about doing something. So the idea that you're never going to meet everyone's concept of perfection, so you can't really try to build 100% consensus, I think that's part of the lesson. But I also think that part of the lesson is we're never going to meet my concept of perfection, or I'm not going to get my concept of perfection, so I need to work on building a consensus around an idea. And I think that comes with just a lot of years of doing this that brings hopefully a better sense of humility than I had before. From the standpoint of what's the difference, we've talked a little bit about that, and that is the size of the city. And what I've said is we don't have the ability, the luxury to move without a sense of urgency. The other thing I'll say is that there's a difference in the way media works. The ability to communicate with the voters and the residents has significantly changed. And that's not always for the better. Before, even though I might scream and yell and kick the trash can because I didn't like the way a story went, there was typically more in depth to it because there was more time, it felt like. You didn't have to get it on social media and beat somebody else to social media, and it wasn't just about clicks. So I've noticed that that's being able to communicate with the public is frankly not just a matter of size being a problem, but the way we go about doing that. And I think that's a significant difference in when you're trying to lead.
Okay, now you've talked about humility, you've talked about consensus building, so you're 6 months into office right now. What are you most proud of in terms of accomplishments?
Well, I would say that's a really great question, because I think the number one thing is that we have really shaken up City Hall. I ran in part because I felt like there was a need to shake up City Hall. My impression was, and I believe it's been proved to be true, that City Hall was not organized in a way so that we could get the best results and achieve the success on the basics that we really wanted to do. And so if you look at the changes we've made, I think that's a big part of it. I'll give you a couple examples. One is, of course, we have a new city manager. We have an interim city manager who's he's won awards for the role that he's played previously as city manager, and he's doing a tremendous job. In my view, we needed a new city manager. I didn't anticipate that would happen as quickly as it did, but I'm glad it did. I'm glad that we moved quickly on that. And if you look at the other changes that have happened at City Hall, you see changes everywhere from the manager of Austin Energy to the manager of the airport to emergency operations to the ACM for public safety. There's been a lot of change there. And then one other thing I would say about that is we've also, I think, been instituting a discipline in the way we go about approaching things even like city council meetings. Now, I'll end up eating this, and let's knock on wood, but the latest city council meeting we've had, so we've proved you can have council meetings that end no later than 5 o'clock, that sort of thing, because we're trying to work with an efficiency and a discipline. So there are a whole lot of issues that we've dealt with, but in terms of just making local government work better, I think that's the thing I'm the proudest of.
Okay, now you mentioned the city manager. We'll talk about Jesus Garza later on in this show, but as we move along here, let's talk about some challenges. You mentioned the media and the changes in, having to get information out faster, but what are some other challenges in the city that you're facing right now?
Well, we've talked about a couple of things. One is the speed of needing to meet people's desires on transportation. That's an example. People have a legitimate reason to feel like things need to be moving faster in that regard. I think that will happen now that we have done some things to make City Hall work better on basic things. Public safety. I inherited a situation where we have a significantly understaffed police department, and that has resulted in slower response times. It has resulted in people feeling less safe than we would want people to feel. And so that's an issue that's a challenge. And the other one I'll mention is the way homelessness has been handled. And I inherited a process there, and we're trying to shift the dynamic in that regard. Those are three issues just by themselves that are challenges that we're addressing, and we're going to continue to address with some dispatch.
And we did not plan this at all, but you led right into my next question.
Well,
when we talk about
great
policing,
instincts, great instincts.
We talk about policing. Of course, Austin has faced some challenges with retaining police officers. And then across the country, you've seen the changes with policing, police culture, trying to make sure that the community that they serve are relatable to them and forge those relationships. So one of the issues in Austin has been the partnership with the DPS.
Sure.
So can you talk about that partnership and how it came about?
Yeah, and as I do that, I want to create a little context. You did a little bit, and I want to add to that. First of all, it's not unique for Austin, Texas. I know we tend to focus on Austin, as we should. It's where we live. But it's not unique to Austin, Texas, that you have a difficulty staffing. That is a national issue. It happens in small cities and large cities all across the country that they're understaffed and there's a difficulty in recruiting. In addition to that, part of the issue that we had to deal with when I first came into office was there was not a contract with the police union. And there had been discussion of needing a contract and a discussion of having a 4-year contract with the police union. Again, I don't think that was handled well, including right up to the very end when the city council was faced with sort of an all or nothing, take it or leave it approach on that. In addition to that, we inherited the fact that there had been a petition drive, that petition drive was seeking to put something on the ballot, and the previous council put it on the ballot for May that would address issues related to police oversight. And a 4-year contract, I want to explain this, having a 4-year contract would have preempted the people's right to vote, because regardless of what they said in that May election, the 4-year contract would have trumped it. And so a lot of us fought for the right of people to have their voice heard under our charter in that election. That had an impact. We knew it would have a consequence. And this council has worked, I think, very hard to address the consequences of its actions. For example, guaranteeing police salaries, guaranteeing and improving retirement, guaranteeing money to recruit better than we've been able to do in the past. But that didn't address the fact that we were still seeing a decline in the number of police. And that's a very important thing. We were recruiting and you were getting some cadet classes, but not as many as you were having people retire and leave the police force. So the hole that we were in continues to get deeper. We need to have better staffing. And I said when I was running, we need to try to get to full staffing. So how do you address that? Well, one way you address that is you do what we're doing with money and recruiting and retention and those sorts of things. But the other is, if you have the ability to bring people in that can supplement and support the Austin Police Department, you look to those sorts of things. So in discussions with the state of Texas, I have one of the things that I've felt like was an advantage if I was elected mayor was that I have good relationships at the state level, was that we would talk to them about, is there a way to partner with, at no cost to the city of Austin, partner with the Department of Public Safety so that we could supplement and support APD and have more officers available.
Okay, so when we talk about that partnership, as you know, there's been a lot of conversation about the partnership. People are saying, well, DPS usually has state oversight. Now they're patrolling Austin streets. And there's been a lot of concern about reports showing that the majority of the stops are people of color. And they feel like it's disproportionate. And what do you say to those people who feel like DPS are patrolling Austin streets, but people of color are the most affected?
Well, let's talk about the whole scenario. First of all, it's not unusual to have the Department of Public Safety involved in, you say, on Austin streets. Mm-hmm. Well, they're on Austin streets anyway, right? They're on Dallas streets. They're on San Antonio streets. It's part of what the Department of Public Safety does. It's not, there's not just some separate state thing, and they enforce the state laws on those roadways as well. When we brought DPS in, what we asked for is for them to help us with a couple things. One is help us reduce violent crime. Two is help us reduce traffic fatalities and increase traffic safety. And three, be there in supportive roles for APD. If there's a call, they could go and be helpful and set the scene, have everything ready until APD was able to get there so that we had quicker response times. And then there's a fourth, which was help us with investigations so that we're doing a better job of solving crimes. The way they were deployed was to say, where do we want more help? And what was determined was they would be deployed where we had the greatest number of distress calls, the greatest number of 911 calls. In other words, if you're going to bring in somebody to supplement and support public safety, where do you want them to go? Well, it makes sense that you would first have them go to places where there is the most violent crime that's being reported. And it worked. We saw a reduction in violent crime as a result of that. Now, part of the way they do that is by making their presence well known. And it is the truth that some people felt like they were being targeted. And we don't want that. So at the very beginning of this conversation, I talked about the concept of not being able to things aren't perfect. At the very beginning of this DPS partnership, I said, and the city of Austin said, that this is going to be something we're going to have to calibrate as we go along. And so that's what's been happening. We have been calibrating it as we go along because it's important that everybody in this town feels safe. And that includes not feeling like you're being targeted or profiled at the same time you're trying to reduce crime and reduce response times. So we're working very hard to calibrate, to change, to make sure we can achieve those goals. This partnership will never be perfect, but I think we're making progress in terms of how we go about approaching it, and we know it's been a success when you ask, what's it doing with regard to crime?
Okay, thank you for that explanation, Mayor Watson. Now, we know we're feeling the heat right now in Central Texas, but another big issue is the responses to cold weather issues. We've had some very what do you call, tense situations in terms of how the city's response has been. You have voiced your opinion about the city's response, for example, to Winter Storm Uri back in 2021. So when we talk about these situations and outages and people being cold and without electricity for days, what are you doing now to ensure that Austinites don't have to experience this type of thing?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, I was not just critical of what happened with Uri, I was critical about Mara, which was right after I got into office. In fact, I joke, but it's tongue-in-cheek, that I had a winter storm right after I got into office. I had a winter storm, and I got COVID, and I said, if you see any locusts or frogs coming my way, please give me a call because I need to know about it. Part of what needs to happen is we need to make sure that in instances, a big part of the Mara issue was that you need to have a vegetation management program so that you don't have trees and tree limbs that fall on wires. Some people say, well, we ought to bury them all. Well, that is a great, quick idea until you start looking at price and what it would cost. And by the way, what it would do in terms of disruption in certain neighborhoods if you went in and said, okay, now we're going to dig up and have to bury lines. So there's some consequences to that as well. One of the issues, I think we saw it just this last storm, this last lightning strike storm that we just had. One of the things that we saw was that there were still some limbs that fell because many folks don't want their trees that do hang over lines to be cut. But we're going to have to do more of that. We're going to have to make sure that we're trimming those trees back so that they do not fall. You're going to ask me something.
You just said many people don't want their trees cut. Now, is that a position that a resident can take, or is there any ordinance that says the city can come in and cut those trees?
Well, the city has always been real deferential to, as you might guess, has been very deferential to people that say, I don't want you cutting my trees. And in fact, the city was so deferential that there's been periods of times where the city has pulled back on its vegetation management plan. We're not going to be able to do that in the same way. And I wish we could, but we're going to have to take actions. Now, the last storm was kind of unique in that it was so bad and it sat in such a place and the ice built up that even limbs that were way up that normally you wouldn't expect to be over a power line. In fact, they might not have been over the power line, but they ended up bending over the power line. So there's some things that nature just makes even harder for us. But we're going to have to take, I don't want to use the word aggressive, but a more intentional approach to avoid some of the things. But I want to end with this. There's always going to be times when lights go out. If you turn on the TV right now and you look at the national news, while there aren't any lights out that I know of sitting here right now at this point in Austin, Texas, there's power out all over the country because of the impact of weather. And that's not an excuse not to do the best job we need to do, but it is something we need to pay attention to. And of course, we have a new general manager at Austin Energy that will be starting. We have an interim right now who's doing a great job, but we have a new permanent coming in the next couple of weeks, and I think that will also make a difference.
When we talk about services and Austin Energy, what is the city doing to ensure equitable access to resources during times of trial and like these weather emergencies?
Well, it's first and foremost in everybody's mind. It is to try to make sure that we're not doing something that creates an inequity. I will tell you that in the emergency operations meeting that we had when we saw that the heat was going to stay with us, and we saw that not just heat, it's Texas, right? It's going to be hot. But when we saw that this extreme heat warning might be a part of what we're dealing with for an extended period of time, one of the very first things that came up is how do we address those people that are vulnerable populations, and as part of that, how do we address people that may not have an air conditioner? And here we're talking about power going out and losing air conditioning. What about those that start without an air conditioner? So it has to be an intentional part of the way we address things, and I promise you it is.
Okay. Well, we're getting some questions from the live stream audience, and I'll read some of those to you. It's not a surprise with the heat we're having that we're talking about water. And so people want to know, are we planning anything innovative to address the water needs of our growing population?
Yeah, that's a tremendous question. And by way of a little bit of history, when I was mayor the first time, one of the things that we did is, in anticipation of becoming a big city, we entered into an agreement where we purchased water so that we would secure our water future for 50 years, and with a flip of a pen, go another 50 years. And then when I was in the Senate, I was involved in making sure that the water management plan of the Lower Colorado River Authority, which has to be approved by TCEQ, that it was done in such a way, is updated in such a way as to help us secure that water. Austin has a water plan for where we go on a regional basis in the future. Austin, with Austin, of course, being a major user there, and we are moving on some of those things. I'll give you an example. We need to move more deliberately with regard to using reusable water, whatever you want to call it, gray water, whatever it is. For example, we're talking right now with the county about how it is we hook up other buildings that are county buildings so that chiller units, irrigation, my hope is that we can start doing it with regard to irrigation of plants and that sort of thing. So conservation programs like that will frankly save money, in this case with the county for taxpayers, but it'll also provide more available water and conserve water. But we also need to be looking at things like how we may store water in aquifers, so that we can use it in times of less water. And there's a plan that we're beginning the process of working on.
Okay, now most everyone is familiar with how in the past you might have people could water on certain days. So one of the questions we got in from the community is, at some point, watering restrictions aren't going to be enough. Are they looking at options for desalination plants or piping in water?
Well, not so much desalination, but to go back to the answer I just gave. What we're looking at is how we can store water better. Austin has always been what's called a surface water city, and that is because we've had run-of-the-river rights with the Colorado River. A lot of in the region, a lot of the surrounding jurisdictions, they're more groundwater because they're taking water out of the ground. We need to be working together as an overall regional unit where we're not poaching water from each other, but we're maybe partnering so that when an aquifer is lower and we have excess water, and what we can do is we can put that water into those aquifers and store it. One of the parts of our long-term agreement was that we would have conservation measures. And the conservation measure was that we didn't have to pay certain money to the Lower Colorado River Authority if we didn't hit a trigger amount of water use. At the time we were negotiating that deal, our numbers all made us think that we probably as Austinites would have to pay money in about 2015. Well, I'm happy to tell you we were wrong. We still haven't had to pay, and we now think it will be past 2030. The point of that being is that we can't go out and buy new water without paying that, but we can store water, we can conserve, and we can save, and that's going to be a big part of what our next steps are.
All right, thank you. Well, earlier in the conversation, you mentioned interim city manager Jesus Garza. So this next question is about that city manager position and its importance to the city. As the city council prepares to hire a new city manager, what is the leadership profile you believe is best suited for Austin?
Well, it's actually a very simple answer. Competence, of course, is at the top. Experience, and what I mean by that is I think we need to have our next city manager needs to be someone with experience managing in city government. That's not to say they need to have been a city manager, but they need to have been in city government because it's a unique role. and it's one that I think requires some qualities and experience that makes a difference. Common sense. Someone that appreciates the form of government that we have. We have a mayor and council, that's the policy-making entity, and we have a manager that's responsible for the administrative parts, carrying out that policy. And that's not always understood by elected officials, by managers, by the public. But it needs to be someone that understands that and is willing to work in a collaborative way with the policy-making body and listen to the public in the way the public makes its voice known through electing people to those positions. So I think that's, competence, common sense ought to be part of that, certain types of experience, and be collaborative.
Okay, now here's another question. You mentioned earlier about having some new leaders and bringing people into these positions. The city has brought back a bunch of directors from retirement. It feels like we're going back in time. Austin has been a progressive city, but not anymore. I am wondering what kind of culture the mayor wants to perpetuate.
Well, there's a whole lot in that. I'm not sure I can get all those points, but let me do it this way. Sure, there are some people that have been brought back. The reason they've been brought back is go to what I was just saying a minute ago. They're people with proven competence. They're people that have proven their common sense. They've had experience at a time when City Hall, in my view, was not structured in such a way where it was taking care of the basics. Things needed to be shaken up. We've talked about some of the challenges just here as we've been visiting. So, sure, that's happened. Austin needs to be a progressive city, to be a city that can have creativity and institute the kinds of ideas that I think the writer of that question is looking for. Local government has to be good at taking care of basic services. Local government has to be able to move quickly on the new ideas, the new thoughts. Austin right now has become a focal point as an international city. The world sees Austin sometimes in a light of that city is on the cutting edge. It is a progressive city with new ideas and moving forward. We cannot do that, either meet the image of the world or meet the desires of our people on the ground unless we have local government working the way it ought to work.
Thank you. Now, switching gears a bit now, the 88th legislative session just ended. There was a lot of conversation about human trafficking, property taxes, Project Connect, and more. So when we talk about these issues, what decisions were made during the session that you believe will most impact Austin?
Oh, we're still sorting a lot of that out, aren't we? One of the things that I think will have a big impact on Austin is this continual push by the legislature to deny local government the ability to make decisions that impact, that have a positive impact on local government, and to make the decisions that local government needs to make. That has been a kind of a constant drumbeat, but this last legislative session with bills to preempt what decisions that cities can make was particularly difficult for cities and the way we're going to go forward. A couple of quick things about that. I'll give you one example. One of the bills that was preempted, one of the bills that preempted something locally was a bill that said local governments can't put into place rules that give construction workers a 10-minute water break, the ability to take a break and drink water. Well, what would you rather have in these circumstances? We need to make sure that people that are in these hot circumstances is what I mean. We need to make sure that people working on those jobs are kept safe. So if local government makes a decision that that's one of the things it wants to do for the safety of its residents and its public, there's no need for that to be preempted. Another part of that is that, in my view, if you look at the state of Texas and the strength of the Texas economy, it is not just some Texas economy, some monolithic Texas economy. It is the sum of its regional component parts. And those regions all have different personalities, different approaches, different types of industry and manufacturing. And so we ought to let those local governments make those decisions that will make a difference. I've often said that they don't give us many tools. There's not a whole lot of tools coming from the state to help local government meet the basics of its citizens, meet the economic development desires of its citizens, so at least stay out of the way. Well, not only are they not staying out of the way, they're actually preempting some of those decisions. And I think that's going to ultimately make a significant difference.
Well, you've been a state senator, spent many years at the Capitol. So when you talk about things as such, what is your approach? What will you do to try to ensure that the city government can lead as it needs to lead? For example, you mentioned the water breaks for construction workers. So as the mayor of Austin, what are you doing? What do you say to legislators?
Well, the good news is that I was up there a bunch. Frankly, I was probably up there more than the joke that we had was that I wasn't even getting paid the $600 a month that members of the legislature get paid, although I was up there all the time. I think one of the good things for Austin is that right now we have a mayor that does have those long-term relationships with people up there. So what I do is I spend a lot of time, and I did it when I was in the legislature as well, I spend a lot of time talking one-on-one with members and friends about what are the actual repercussions of making decisions like that, and what is the goal you seek to achieve with that legislation? What is it you really want out of it? If it's to punish cities for something you just disagreed with politically, well, that's significantly different than if you want to really look at a policy that makes a difference. And so I will continue to take the kind of time and spend the energy that you need to spend to make have those relationships, but also make sure folks understand the implications.
Thank you. So earlier we also talked about transportation and traffic. So here's this next question. It's about Project Connect. Project Connect is an initiative to provide light rail and transit options throughout the Austin area. Where are we now on this initiative?
Well, as the questioner may know, there was an effort to try to, no pun intended, derail Project Connect during the legislative session. That didn't happen. One of the key things that needed to happen for this project that the public has said it wants, by a significant margin, the public voted to do this, was we needed to have a vote that was of three entities. The City of Austin City Council, which voted unanimously to move forward with Project Connect in the last month. Capital Metro, which will operate the system, its board of directors it voted unanimously to move forward. And then there was a third party, which is a partnership that was created between the City of Austin and Capital Metro called the Austin Transit Partnership. And that board of directors moved or voted unanimously to move forward. So now we have everything in place from a check the box votes and legal standpoint to continue to move forward. So we went through a wonderful, just a terrific community involvement process where we got information from the community about what line that people wanted us to move forward with first. And that resulted in that vote by that tri-party vote. And so now design and everything else starts moving forward. You will see in this budget of the city, we will vote to make the transfer of the property tax dollars that the city collects that will then go to the local government corporation that's Austin Transit Partnership. That will be part of this upcoming budget process to keep that moving forward.
Okay, as I mentioned at the beginning of this one-on-one conversation, our live stream audience can send questions in, and we're getting a lot of those right now. So one of the questions is, along with transportation, housing is one of the biggest issues for people living and moving to Austin. What initiatives are you taking to address affordability and housing?
Yeah, well, I'm going to start with housing, and then affordability, in my view, has become often just about housing. And I think we need to think of affordability bigger, and I'll come back to that. I would say that in the first 6 months, the Austin City Council has done as much as we've seen in years when it comes to housing. Part of that is I think the city, and I've said this for a while, I think the city kind of got stagnated when it came to affordable housing because it was a kind of an all or nothing approach. If you didn't, if you didn't do this all in approach, you would end up with nothing. And frankly, that's kind of what we ended up with. So what this council has done is it's looked at a variety of tools that it wants to make available so that we can move housing and make it easier. So things like, we were just talking about transit. This council has voted, it voted unanimously to begin the planning process to allow for what are referred to as ETODs, equitable transit-oriented development, so that along transit lines, we will have greater density and greater housing available. Something that needed to happen, and we did that very rapidly. Things like dealing with parking requirements, where the additional requirements related to parking sometimes drove up the cost of the housing that was being built. So we needed to address that. That's been taken out. Compatibility standards that would make a difference. So I could go on because it's been a very affirmatively moving council to address those different things. The second thing is I asked McKinsey and Company, an international consulting company, to come in and do a top to bottom, soup to nuts review of our development services department. Because everyone, I mean, you never talk to anybody that didn't say that the time it takes to get a permit, the cost of getting a permit, a site plan approved, those sorts of things were adding lots of time and therefore lots of cost. I brought them in. They agreed to do it pro bono, the review, if you will. I anticipate that will come back as a report to council in July. I think they'll be finished just any day now. I'm waiting for them to come back and me to get a final report on it. And based upon what has already been made me aware about, it's going to make an enormous difference. And we will, as part of this budget process, I anticipate budget so that we can implement all that they want to do. And then the final thing I want to say about that is that when I think of affordability, yes, housing, how we make housing, we have more housing, how we make housing more affordable. And you hear me saying we've been working aggressively in that regard. But in addition, the way you make things affordable for folks is you make sure they have more money in their pocket. And I want us to change the economic development paradigm in this community, where it's not just counting the number of new jobs we created at the end of every year, holding up a trophy and saying we won, although I want to keep creating those jobs. I want us to judge our success by how many people here locally we're putting into those jobs. So I want our workforce development to be a key component. A minute ago we were talking about transportation, and I said we had $20 to $25 million of infrastructure projects. That creates an economic sector by itself. And I know we have a gap in terms of skills because we need more training. So I have, and we'll be announcing more about this, but I've been working with Workforce Solutions, Tamara Atkinson at Workforce Solutions, and we're in the process of doing a study, never been done in Austin, Texas, of what are our skill gaps in these areas and what are the programs that are in existence and the pipelines, and how do we put that on steroids so we put more people in those jobs so that they have more money and more ability to afford. And then the last thing I'll say is childcare has to be a key part of that, and we're working on initiatives in that regard. The number 2 cost in most households where people have children, behind the housing cost, is childcare. and that makes a difference in the ability to afford to live in this town.
So can you talk more about childcare? That's one of the community questions coming in. What are we doing? What can families expect to see in regards to any type of assistance, perhaps?
Well, that is the right question to ask. And if I were to say, I've got this, and this as the answers to that, they would be made-up answers. What I'm doing instead is I'm putting together, working with some other council members, working with the county judge and some others, a lot of folks that are doing we have some tremendous work going on in childcare in this community, the Success by Six program and other programs that make a big difference. What we're going to do, though, is not jump to the conclusion. Too often what happens is, in the area of childcare, what I hear is, if we just had this money, we could do this. But what we're not doing is we're not preparing a more comprehensive approach and plan where we know all of the different factors. So very soon, I hope to be announcing, frankly, had the legislature not been here this session, I think I'd already announced this, but the timing will be very soon that we'll be announcing a program to get all of those answers so that we can come to the public and say, here's a comprehensive approach. Now let's figure out how we're going to implement that.
Thank you, Mayor Watson. Now, this next question, you can see we're interactive with our live stream audience, and so people are asking, will you recommend in regards to public comment at council meetings? The technology exists to allow remote participation. Do you see this as an option to ensure equity and access?
Well, we're already doing that. The pandemic revealed that you can do that and be successful in terms of hearing from folks. And so at every council meeting, we have the ability for people to communicate with the council remotely we have, you can call in. We usually take the first people that we take up when we take public communication is we take those who are calling in, so they don't have to sit on hold that long, or as even longer. We take them, and then we take those that are there in person. So we try to make it easier for people, and as you indicate, from an equitable standpoint, somebody can call in as opposed to having to drive down there, sit, wait, that sort of thing. They can continue to do some of their life chores at the same time they're waiting to then let the council know what they're thinking.
Okay, another question, Mayor Watson, is when we talk about access, what about computer access? It's a digital world now. You mentioned the news earlier, and most everything, like now I can look at questions that people are sending in from their homes. So when we talk about computer access, what are we doing to help people who don't have that access, who want to apply for jobs, but the jobs only require computer access or digital application? Well,
depending on how that question is being asked, just recently, as part of the bilateral infrastructure, I'm going to say bilateral, bipartisan infrastructure law that's been passed, part of the concept of what infrastructure is, think about this. 30 years ago, when we thought about infrastructure, we didn't think about the ability to access the internet and do what you just talked about. That's going to make available to cities and local governments more ability to create access. And I anticipate that you'll see us take an aggressive approach with the Biden administration and that money that's now available, billions of dollars of money, so that we'll be able to act in a way that will create greater equity.
Thank you, Mayor Watson, for your time today. We're very glad to have you answer all of these questions. We also want to thank our audience at home for participating and sending in all those great questions so the mayor can explain what's going on in the city of Austin. That is our time today. We want to thank Mayor Watson for this one-on-one conversation. Perhaps you were moved to take action today and wonder, what can I do? Well, you can get involved by going to your city council meetings. You can speak with your city council representative. You can also talk to your neighbors and try to get insight about what's happening in your communities. Then share it. Send an email, write a letter, let people know in the city, let the city council know how you feel about what's happening in this city. Of course, that helps all of us. So on behalf of Austin PBS and Leadership Austin, I'm Sonta Henderson. Thank you for watching.